again. It's weird, isn't it? 60 years later, or whatever number of years, I hate to think, that we're coming out with another archigram. And I think I want to give a bit of almost fairly serious background reasoning or information, rather than just exuberantly saying, buy the book, here it is, it's colored. No, I think it's, I was just thinking this morning, sitting on the loo, as one has one's ideas, about agencies of enthusiasm. I think WAF itself could be described as an agency of enthusiasm. All sorts of weird people come together, and Uncle Paul here sort of knows half of them, doesn't know the others. They emerge, they mix, they're weird, they're odd combinations. But the total thing, we come away after 3 days, as Jan and I have been coming for donkey's years, we come away with great sort of buzz at the end of it. And I'm looking back, and there's another analogy, which was we were at a concert of an ad for my son, A.G. Cook. We were at one of his concerts the other night in London, and Ricardo Dostos, who appears in the magazine, turned to me and said, you know, we miss that enthusiasm. These kids, these guys who now have this music collective, PC Music, and they all get together and they have different sort of voices, male, female, sideways. They're a sort of enthusiastic conglomeration. And so the reasoning is Archigram was, and I hope is, again, a combination of enthusiasm, an agency for enthusiasm. And so just backtracking over the old archigrams, they started off as a sheet done on a Roneo machine, you don't know what that is, and printed across the street. Then it became a sort of enthusiasm for certain things that did more. I think the new archigram, if it has any resemblance to the earlier series, probably in essence resembles numbers 2 and numbers 5, which were really collecting a whole lot of people that we didn't particularly know very well. Some of them were dead, and some of them were a long way away, and some of them were weird. But we were interested in the projects. And then the sort of core group, or the core group, emerges from that later, so that the more concentrated issues, which was in a sense thematic, such as numbers 4, number 7, number 9, were more concentrated. But the outreach comes first, then the looking at what that's adding up to be comes later. Okay, so now boredom. I think that the terrible 50, 60 years in between have mostly ended up in, not necessarily in the tents here today, but down in London and large parts of Europe and even North America. Very boring architecture. My God, it goes on and on. When will it end? But the great thing about Archigram is optimism. It's not just enthusiasm, it's not just blind enthusiasm, it's optimism. That there's been, I think, since the dreaded pandemic, an excuse for being pessimistic. Not only the butterfly generation, but the ballsy generation have sort of been dragged down by it, and then sort of wriggling up and looking for hope. No, we never lost. I did some of my best drawings during the lockdown. To hell, you know. Sat in the garden, did drawings. Quite restful. So Archigram is about futures, but it's also about inventing. It's also about. So I make no apology for putting some of my own fairly recent. I'm not only wearing it, but I'm drawing it and combining it and looking at it again, rolling it over. But the key thing, I think, is in the detail, what it says here about drawing. Drawings are exciting. Drawings can be wayward. That's very important. Drawings can be very, very precise, also important. And drawings can be prescient. Doodles, which is really what I think drawings are sometimes direct, spontaneous link to much of the material that follows. Yet doodles can often be unencumbered, that you just doodle them and roll on. So maybe Archigram is a collective doodle. And if that's the conclusion that you come to too, I will not be displeased. Experiment, of course, lies at the core always. And somebody like Natchard, close friend and sometimes colleague, makes for many years and still is making strange machines. He doesn't want me to tell you this, but he's an expert on cladding systems and worked for GMW for some years on cladding systems. But he's left that. Has he left it behind? Not sure. He now makes machines that spray paint. He makes machines that look at dioramas, that are very precisely interested in the landing of the point of a drawn piece or drawn dot. And then it revolves back because his machines, of course, that enable this are architectural pieces. And there was a movement in recent years in a certain part of the London scene which was to do with in a way, to do with gadgetry, to do with the wonderful in-word at the time was device. A device is something that does something or enables something. It doesn't necessarily end up as a building, but it has all, in a sense, the prototypical qualities of a building. And that is the king of the device, and the evacuated stomach, if you will. So that's another conversation. Now, one of his heroes, and one of the old Archigram groups, still alive and well and drawing up there in Rhode Island, is Michael Webb. And I was rereading the text. By the way, this Archigram, I looked at the differences, trying to look objectively the differences between this Archigram and the earlier ones. There's far more chit-chat, there's far more writing. And as David, my publisher, keeps saying, it's actually some of it's really very serious writing, even if it's on colored paper, etc., etc. Far more writing, and of course far more girls in it than there would have been 60, 50 years ago. But Mike Webb is also possessed by another attitude towards time. The generator of the projects shown in the mag is actually early constructions for the extension of the building. And he writes here about the fact that all of us in Archigram way back used to keep saying a lot of buildings are much better halfway built than the final object. We were always talking about things with scaffolding on, evacuated space and so on. And he comes back to that and says, okay, here is a process of housing where the machine for fabricating pieces of the housing is rolling along at the side of the whole strip. And it's producing, as in a little way, those who have a long memory will know Mike Webb's Rent-A-Wall project. This is really a kind of extended, refined, slightly abstracted extension of the Rent-A-Wall project. And in a way, although he's the one Archigram member who's never built anything, as far as I know, never worked except early days on Euston Station. We won't talk about that. But as himself has never built anything, but is more obsessed by the process of building than those of us who, from time to time, have done some building, which is intriguing. He sat there mostly in Rhode Island, sometimes in New York, drawing the extension of the extension of the extension of the detail of a process. And I guess you can either call that an intellectual exercise, a masturbatory exercise, or something where, you know, the pushes and pulls of the day, that when you are building something, things are moving too fast and involve so many issues that actually whether the process was correct, whether the intellectual sequence of the process correct, gets lost. You're just trying to get the thing built. And Mike was able to, I think, have this wonderful objectivity. And he's still at it, same age as me. And in the mag, we're able to put one of his beautiful, I mean, there's another paradox there, because he's talking about a sort of automatic process, but he is the graphic artist par excellence with the pencil and with the paintbrush. I mean, he's like an old master painter, which is, I love these paradoxes. Now, Eric Moss, I have to defend that building on the right, which was hated by prominent British critics. I saw it, Eric took us around it a few months ago, and it's a knockout. It's absolutely stunning. But in the mag, he moves aside. He knows probably that everybody reading the mag will know that building, the wraparound building. But he will talk more about, again, theory. I mean, Moss is an intriguing character because really he's a very literary animal, very literary philosophic animal. I think he has a literary degree before doing architecture. And yet he covers it in this sort of laconic throwaway language. He, too, is actually very, very precise. So this, I didn't intend it, but somehow this issue of precision comes into the story. This lady is sort of well known on the London scene for doing very slightly quirky, intriguing buildings, but very Englishy. But if you dig around, and I had to dig around, I had to almost force her to expose this project, which I sort of knew, that she has been a wild kid not so very long ago. And I'm intrigued by the fact that several of the people in the mag, as they started to come back to me, were doing things to do with the house. And I recall that in early Archigram days, we said, we've eliminated the house, we've bypassed the house, we've all gone into everything in mattresses and headphones. But actually, in the end, in a sense, we are in love with the idea of the house by dismantling it, by setting it up in the air. We're actually saying we want to, it's a pruning operation. We want to still be talking about houses, as my recent and highly talented colleague Gavin. Another thing that comes in with not only the experimental house, but of course again is that sort of the London wing of drawing. A particular precise drawing that originates in hand drawing is not always actually hand drawing. Doesn't matter, it's to do with the line, to do again with the precise tweaking of position, which is something we used to talk about a lot in teaching. It's not just the basic idea, it's not just the philosophy, it's actually how you tweak. Really good architects tweak very, very well. And this is one of his recent experimental houses in the colored tweaked condition. I think a great fave and friend is Neil, and he did this drawing, I think, specially for the magazine. And of course, those of you who know Neil Denari's work will see that in some way it pulls away from his recent, slightly more commercial projects into, again, this laying of not quite the Nat-Chard gadget, but a kind of machine element in amongst the kind of texture, shall we call it, of the house. But then his own experimental houses, I think, have been something else as well, not just machines, but incredibly concerned with volume. They are voluminous experiments. Another Los Angeles-based person who you may have known less, Florencia Pita, is one of the key teachers at SciArc. And she is the fruitiest of the fruity digital people, what I call the colored hedgehog school of SciArc. And her house, if you look at the plan, the basic plan appears to be very, very orthodox. And then it sprouts this peculiarity around it, which I think those of us who are not lovely Argentinians of a certain generation wouldn't dare ever do, because we'd have to explain, as English and North Europeans, we'd have to explain why it sprouts. Florence is above and beyond all that. She makes it sprout, for fuck's sake. Marcos, another, Portuguese-German Londoner, who's been experimenting mostly with vegetation. He grows buildings. His experimental work is really physically growing matter. And then sometimes he pulls it in to this. By the way, what you're wondering what's on the left-hand side, that's a piece of an interview which I did with Katrina, who is Catherine, who is of ABB, who used to help subsidize this event, and actually they paid for the magazine. That's why we're able to do it at all. Marcos, therefore, has been making these actual objects which look into growies, hangies, etc., and then formalizes it around this house project, which is featured in the magazine. But there's another theme, which of course is always sitting around that, which is the exploration of space. And I don't mean moon landing space, I mean space that we are actually in. And one of my old ex-students from Frankfurt days is another Argentinian. In fact, there's quite a lot of Argentinians sneaking around in the magazine, so it would seem. Not by intention, it's just they're talented. And Thomas Saraceno was a wonderful student whose project mostly at the Stadelschule was smoke. And then he's kind of graduated from smoke through to people in space, hanging in space, and wonderful mesh-like interiors. He's had some very, I think those of you who follow art shows, we were delighted when we went to see the art museum in Lisbon, done by Ala, that actually he was in the first show. So there we were with two people we knew, one who'd done the building, and one making a space within the space within the space. And he still has a sort of soft spot for architecture, even though he claims he doesn't do it. I think he's actually still doing it. Same with Marion Coletti. Now, Marion, when I did a book about drawing in the second edition, we had a long conversation, which we published, where Marianne, who was my wife's student at one point, he said, I don't sketch anymore, but I sketch. And it was a weird conversation because I couldn't get my head. He said, I don't sketch with a pencil. I sketch with a computer. But his things always look so elegant that it raises again the question, what is the doodle and what is the sketch? And what does that mean creatively? Marianne's an amazing teacher, but also an amazing experimenter. You have to buy his book. I'm not here just to sell books, but by the way, it's worth buying. And he's now sort of combining the unlike with the unlike. So he's moved a bit off the sort of only the orthodoxy of the totally digitally produced thing, but he's become a scavenger, which I rather like. I rather like the adjoining conversation of the scavenger to do with the scribbler. Is the scavenger a kind of lateral scribbler? A bit of an odd conversation, this. I don't know where it's going to lead us. Whereas Cesare Battelli uses AI. I mean, let's all this fearsome thing about what is AI going to do, and is it going to, are we, I've been through about 2 or 3 iterations of whether what one does is lost and therefore irrelevant. I can't use the computer except for putting together lectures and letters. I can't, I can just about do the airbrush, and I can't sing very well. But nonetheless, you find something that is, as here, an instrument for what you can do. He goes straight to the AI and produces these weird things that I don't know whether to laugh or cry, but he had to be in the mag. I don't know the guy. He claims he was a student of mine. I don't remember him. Probably will when I see him. But I had to have him in the magazine because it's sort of itchy provocative. Probably upset nearly everybody else in the magazine. I mean, a lot of these people don't know each other. You might think it's a little clique. The clique only exists in my head. And a lot of them probably would hate each other if they met each other, which is all right. Herron, he's a force of nature. Herron, I shouldn't mention the fact that he's the husband of Florencia, because their work is very different, but nonetheless happens to be. And at the moment, for his sins, he's the head of SCIARC. And you're getting pissed off by education, as many people are, but he's still running SCIARC. And some of his stuff, these wonderful characters, you can see there's no cigar in the picture. It's very unusual to see picture of Herron without the cigar. It's very important, that. But some of his stuff is quite disgusting. And he describes it as meat, M-E-A-T. He enjoys its meatiness and its juiciness and its I suppose it's controlled flamboyance. Although in the magazine he also puts a fairly, not looking straightforward, but actually a straightforward project, a competition proposal. Yeah, now I did include some commentators. I didn't want to have any of the crabby English ones. I think they've always been grudging. I think they were grudging towards Archigram. I think they were grudging towards Zaha. I think they were grudging towards almost anybody who was really, really interesting. They just like it all nice and quiet and pleasant and politically correct. So f them. And I got in some, not that I don't think these are, typically I don't think any of these characters voted for Trump. But nonetheless, they are mostly Americans, well, with the odd Belgian and the odd Canadian. But largely, I went to the enthusiasm that when I've met these people. Don't always agree with them, but they got balls and they're enthusiastic. They say funny things, which the mealy-mouthed English never do. So I put the Americans in there. Now, aesthetics, space and aesthetics. Aesthetics, of course, my wife uses a different term, but I use the word aesthetics. And it's interesting, here, two people I have old, long-time friends, builders of many buildings. Thom is now in his studio around the corner from the Morphosis office most of the days, producing these artworks which are based upon digitalized views of substance or vegetation, passing through, just for reference, not in the mag, I put some intermediary work which I think is wonderful, these three-dimensional objects that he's been producing, which are folded. They're really prototypes for cities at some end, and he has quoted them in one of his Chinese projects, but he's moved from just layering space and putting objects in, say in the Cooper Union building, to moving through to three-dimensional layered, impregnated, almost impregnated cities, to the artworks, and now to the surface and the vegetation. Very interesting process. Another friend of mine who did, I think, a great graphic is another builder, who's Odile Decq, who builds proper buildings intricately, but occasionally just makes a graphic that actually in the mag you get Thom's picture and Odile's picture opposite each other, because I think they're extraordinary for people who are thought of as building architects and teaching architects. And I hope he's in the room. The Tezukas I've seen, maybe they're in the room. Hello. And despite the success, enormous success of the school building, they're still thinking of how to explode the school building, to go further than that lovely kindergarten does, and to explode it and explode it. And it's a sort of, again, this is completely, I think especially done for the mag, a scribble that moves it on to another dimension, whirling. And of course, just as in early Archigram days, Archigram project, which you dismantle the city in order to return to thinking about the city. It's this process of constantly dismantling and then rethinking. There's some rather different directions this time. I mean, Ecologic Studio, who do a lot of projects and appear in almost every biennale with experimental things to do with biochemistry, the edible bio-food, which tastes pretty bloody awful, but I like them and I eat it. And always include their two kids in the picture, using their structures and eating their bio stuff. They've moved on into talking about the city, and the text of this is really quite sort of scary. It's all about effluent. It's all about the waste coming out in Holland, and then how you re-swirl the waste, and the waste coagulates into some unpleasant kind of new new formations, and that becomes a kind of new biocity. It's weird shit, but I love weird shit. I mean, why not? Now, this is one of my faves. Iles Engelis, a while back, discovered this guy doing a competition in Cyprus, because the Cypriots couldn't handle it. But Pedro, one of the youngest people in the mag, he's another force of nature. And he is from Madrid. His project in this, again, is the idea of a floating city, which is the parts of which, the islands of which, are based upon pop music festivals. So they are pieces of pop music festival that float independently. He has done a degree in music before he ever did architecture, and I think this infuses his work. But I just go back to the Cypriot project, which was quite an extraordinary tour de force, and he's constantly coming second in competitions, which is always intriguing. I mean, the old Ron Herron, Warren Chalk were always coming second in competitions, which is how I ever got to know about them. So watch people who come second in competitions, often better than people who win them. And here he is still at it, this time in Berlin. I love these guys, and I was intrigued to see what they suggested. They would make a piece of city, but this is still one of my fave projects, the bicycles, which I did see in reality once in Hong Kong. An old friend from way back, not normally thought of as a sort of experimental person. I was just intrigued to see what she was up to now, and her, again, the text is very interesting to read. These, normally I put again a bit of a reference to the earlier work, which is very known, where the idea of collecting pieces of sort of plastic detritus and making it into a sort of children's city. And then their work in timber, which is very, very developed. They sit up there in Norway, and they have also started talking about re-inhabiting. And isn't it funny that the scribble is so similar to that of Ecologic Studio? Something's going on in the bending, whirling, material, drifty world. And then continuing the exploration of substance. So Izaskan writes about, here's another funny irony, she writes about drawing in black and white, yet the essence of Izaskan, another raver from Madrid, that her work is predominantly highly colored. But for the purpose, and she didn't know we couldn't print in color, because we can, but she wanted to talk about making things in black and white. Odd, intriguing. And Ricardo and Nanette, now finally, not just theoretical people, they've made a lot of publications in sort of serious architectural fringe magazines, such as Lebbeus Woods' one way back, and from the A and Pamphlet Architecture. But now they are starting to make things, not very far from here, actually, in Indonesia. They're making their first built structures. And again, it's this weird skin, not weird shit this time, but let's say weird skin phenomenon. I've included Vinka, who I regard highly as a leader of a school. I think she got Penn to be really, really good school in recent years. Now she's stepped aside, sadly. And it's done also, intriguingly, for many people here from London, she's done a house in Primrose Hill, which none of the English architectural press seem to have noticed. Though it's really an interesting one. But she's still also thinking about the theory rather than just making the successful project, successful build. So here or there are people who are actually successful building architects who are still thinking out of the box. Elena Manfredini, another SciArc person, mostly thought of as sort of rather pictorial skins and skins with flowers on and skins of bent rubber. Here going slightly straight, though I couldn't resist putting her studio in there. You can see the sort of process that she's doing. So she's somebody who would have traditionally, I mean, she's actually an engineer by training, would have traditionally been thought of as a decorator, but actually questioning the nature of substance again. And a great conversation between two friends. I'd invited them separately. And then they said, can we do a conversation between us? Which is rather intriguing. And they're basically rather small, but they show various projects that they have done, which Barry is the fruity, loudmouth Glaswegian, teaching in Penn. Gilles is the laconic and amusing Belgian, who isn't like all the boring Belgians that you get in the Architectural Review, but a really interesting Belgian, who's concerned with digital production, mostly of plywood components, and he can make almost anything out of these plywood components. And there they are, chatting and chatting and chatting away. This is Barry's work, which has slight similarities, I suppose, to Mark Foster Gage, but I think he's more of a thinker than Gage. And the youngest head of an architecture school that I can think of, still in her 30s, is Silly Filak, who links with some of the other digital people because she came out of the Angewandte Kunst and studied with Greg Lynn, and is doing stuff in this extraordinary, but not time to talk about it, extraordinary little pocket called Tallinn, Estonia, which is to be watched. In fact, if you work your way through the magazine, you'll see Tallinn mentioned 3 or 4 times by different people. It punches well above its weight. People who do build but stick to their guns in terms, again, interested in the question of weaving and enclosure. I think they're amongst the most talented people in London. I've never taught with them or anything like that. I just recently got to know them because I think their work's great. And so that's the explanation. My real criteria for putting people in the magazine is that they interest me. Don't necessarily know them all. I know all of them, at least met them a couple of times. Some of them I know extremely well. But it's more that they interest me. So the theme of the magazine is people what interest P. Cook, if you like. A bit low level, but it'll do. For Malhout, who do very strange installations. I've known them since they were students in middle Germany, in a very small town outside Frankfurt, where they have infiltrated the town with a series of very strange, intricate, obsessive, weird, gadgety build. I mean, they link in a sideways way back to Nat Chad again with these constructions. I hope you guys are here. It's great to have you in. And again, the proposition of the naughty high-rise, which needs to be talked about, at least here. And finally, discovery by drawing. Perry Culper is a cult figure in the drawing scene. He's a collagist, but he is also an advocate. And he can draw in every which way. And a lot of his early work is very, these are recent stuff. But he's able to place the unlike with the unlike with the yet more unlike. Whereas most of us tend to think in sort of conglomerate terms, or in straight sets. He blows the set, he introduces something that, why is it there? Why is it contradicting the rest? And he does that entirely by visual methods. And a sort of parallel person, but coming from another direction, is the American-Canadian Mark West. And he had this institute for many years in Manitoba, where he hung concrete into sacks. And you can go to weird parts of the world. You can go to Copenhagen, you can go to Chile, and find that Mark West has been there and has hung his concrete. Then suddenly the institution kicked him out, said enough of that, and he now draws. But his drawings, the first drawings I saw of his were pencil work, where the India rubber made the drawing. He rubbed up this heavy pencil, but now he's moved to a very interesting, weird territory, yet his background is in substance, and I find that a very interesting issue. David is an explorer of the remote places. You find him doing projects in Greenland, in the Arctic, in the Antarctic. He goes, he's a Barcelona original guy who lives in Denmark, and again has absorbed, as he passed through London for some years, he absorbed that precise drawing thing. Another couple who have appeared in many of art exhibitions as well, and they now run at the Bartlett the new sort of landscape course, so they are architects. And they're concerned with the way in which we can survive by patches of reworked territory, but in this case, in this project, in terms of linear arrangements of that. Their earlier work was very much to do with houses falling in the sea and decay and sand and dunes, and again, the substance of the land interacting with the pieces of constructed architecture. And here's just a lovely weirdo that Yell and I love when we go to Tokyo. Is Taki Suzuki, who just collects. He teaches in China, in Wuhan, but he's really a Tokyo person and a Kyoto person when we first met him. And he collects odd phenomena, ghosts and corners, and takes you to the spookiest places you could ever find. Anyway, I mean, if you're with Taki in Kyoto, it's a weird experience full of strange things happening in the wall and odd seances, and he's an atmosericist, if there's such a term. And the irony is that after all that, we live, the survivors, 3 out of the 4, within a kilometre of each other in Swiss Cottage. So we haven't moved on very much. And Dennis is writing about that period of time. David is collecting still, he's always been the collector of phenomena that make you feel slightly uncomfortable. And I'm just scribbling, and I couldn't resist at the end of the scribbling saying, well, I'm not doing this sort of stuff, I'm doing projects. This is my latest, which I did with Piercy and Company together as a joint thing between our office and theirs. And hopefully Mr. Tehran is going to be interested in it, it seems. And finally, it's about being cheerful.
Peter, there might be 1 or 2 people in the audience who don't know that the word archigram originally meant architectural telegram, which might also explain why there weren't too many words in it. And as you said, there are a lot more words here. Can you tell us something? Having selected these people, they sent you their drawings, you then edited and designed and laid out.
Well, we had a design.
How did that thing work?
I wasn't the designer. We had a very clever and exuberant Portuguese ex-Royal College guy that does art catalogues. And we rather let him rip. I don't know, something too rip. There weren't, I mean, we did give, David and I sent a fairly precise, we said we want a scheme. We don't want you to do anything like, except for the 5 people I call the journalists who are not, you know, they had a different brief. But send not more than 500 words and a scheme that is optimistic. Now that leaves a very wide thing. We did boot out a couple of things that we didn't, you know, here and there, not very much. And there are a few, everybody said, yes, we will, but some people were very tardy in sending stuff. I mean, one person I would love to have in the magazine was a guy called Liam Young, who I think is amazing. He said, yes, yes, I will, yes, yes, I will. We just couldn't, you know, it never came. So there's a certain thing called printing dates. Yeah, and I mean, the logistics aren't all that interesting. I think I deliberately did what I would have done when I was a teacher, which is to say, you're in the thing, therefore you have a pretty loose brief. Even if I might find it disgusting, unpleasant, weird, if I don't find it very interesting, then it might be out in the bin.
Yeah, because I remember you curated the British Pavilion at Venice a few years back, and you included architects who you thought were interesting, but one or two actually really didn't like the work. But on the other hand, they were obviously having some sort of impact, and you thought that they should be shown.
Well, I can go very far back. When I had a thing called ArtNet in the 70s, I had the Creer brothers, who at that time seemed to be anathema. And I wanted to see, as they say, the colour of their eyes. And in fact, I got on well with Leo Creer's, neither here nor there, but the fact was their work was totally opposite Archigram. And I'm interested in how, not going into a corner, I like to see the work that I don't like, because it might be cleverer than the work I do like. That's one issue. It's a sort of tease. I find it harder to read work I don't like. I find it harder to listen to music of a kind I don't like, because the genre gets in the way. Most architects don't have a sort of narrative genre. Maybe they develop it if they're good at that sort of thing. I mean, Nigel's a wonderful use of words, but generally it's the stuff, you're pushing the edge of your own tolerance, really.
One thing I wanted to ask you was, when Archigram 1 first came out, a sort of lost world of pounds, shillings and pence, and a London that was a mixture of the sort of stuffy and the day glow. I mean, it was still the establishment, but also the Beatles and the Stones. Architecturally, looking back, what were you reacting against? Or was it actually
very easy.
you wanted to be for something which happened to be against something? I always think of it as an absolute rejection.
No, it was.
and
I think it
reaction.
was a group of people. We all came from different schools. The three of us who started it, Mike, Dave, and I, we came from different schools, but we were working in our office for the first or maybe second time in an office. We realised it was all just production and concrete and production and occasionally sort of somebody trying to be elegant, but there wasn't much guts to it. And we'd done all this sort of stuff as kids, and it was then the older group came in, Ron and Warren and so on, who had built, and it was that then affected as I said earlier, the magazine, but also affected the conversation. But it wasn't. I think also there was a conscious, on my part, looking at through Banham's connection, looking at Frühlicht, the magazine that Bruno Taut had in 1918 to 20. In Berlin, which you can see as a slightly parallel moment, if you like, looking at funny small magazines that were knocking around at the time, some of them from Switzerland, some from Finland, Carrie Blur from Finland, Polygon from Poly in London. I mean, one had the pamphlet seemed to be an interesting way of using, and I'm back to the agency of enthusiasm again, which I only just thought of an hour ago. What links WAF with Archigram with doing it now? Agencies of enthusiasm. Now, at one time, one or two schools of architecture were also agencies, I have to mention this, were agencies of enthusiasm. Occasionally, there were places that were agencies. I mean, I'm always fascinated by things like Vienna in about, 1910 to 1920, the fin de siècle Vienna, as Shorty calls it, or something like Detroit at the time when Old Man Saarinen and Young Man Saarinen and Cranbrook and IIT, they were all happening there at that time. I think Tokyo in the period probably 80s, 90s, still a bit now. There are certain moments and certain places. They might be studios, they might be schools, they might be pamphlets, let's call them, They might be a film. I think they're agencies of enthusiasm. I think this event is an agency of enthusiasm, different, but that's what I'm really interested in. I'm still interested in it.
When you look at the work, the people you chose and the work that they submitted, do you see anything in common about what might they be reacting to? Is there any sort of general thing?
I think most of them I would describe as having sufficient dynamic within themselves to just bloody do it. You know, they're not butterflies. They're not even, I don't think they're necessarily reacting to, I think, as I said for myself, I was quite creative during lockdown. You make of it what you can. I think most of the people in the thing were just doing stuff. They didn't sort of go outside very much, didn't take the car out or the plane or whatever. And I think I'm trying to think very quickly through a myriad of these people. They're all pretty motivated. So it's the survival of the motivated. Now that's difficult if somebody is a nice, talented person but doesn't have that extra, what Reimagining used to call killer instinct. We used to have conversations way back about so-and-so's gossip. Gossip, and we say, yeah, so-and-so hasn't got the killer instinct. It's not gonna happen. It's another long conversation which needs a few drinks to sustain it. But I think these things are, and speaking as a retired head of school and all that stuff, at best, when architecture schools were really dynamic, you could have this thing and it could run across dozens of people. You know, even the weakest in the room would get something out of it. And so it's sort of cri de coeur also.
I wanted to sort of, in conclusion, get some thoughts from you about the nature of drawing. I mean, you were sort of speculating about, well, what's the difference, let's say, between a scribble, a sketch, etc. Do you see it as just a kind of spectrum and it might appear anywhere along there, or do you see definite categories of thing, especially with the ability to generate through AI and to
Well, I think it's
around?
interesting. I mean, the Batelli thing is fascinating because I've seen it on Facebook and stuff, and I sort of said, you have to have this in for somebody, and then people say, oh, it's all AI. I said, okay, so what? I don't care what was done with your toenail and a robot or whatever the hell. But I think that, I mean, Nigel and I were just having a quick conversation about sketchbook. I don't do sketches. I do occasionally do a sort of organizational doodle. One of the best sets of sketching I've ever seen was the late Jim Sterling. Mostly his tutorial sketches that he would do in Düsseldorf, because some of the Düsseldorf guys showed me them. They're always about armatures. And then this lead on to Thom Mayne. We've had a long conversation about Sterling's armatures, because if you look at Thom Mayne's buildings, they're to do with armatures. And he's a sculptor more than a sketcher. I mean, it can go into farting around with plywood or I mean, Nat is a maker. He does paint. I've never seen his sketches. I don't do sketches. I do early runs and then throw drawings away.
With huge enthusiasm, and we admire the shirt based on one of
the shirt,
your own
there's a long
paintings.
Story to the shirt, which
for another occasion. It could be the introduction to Archigram 11. Peter Cook,
Indeed.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.